Good morning. Let me just talk briefly about why we're here today. We were asked to take a look at an account that existed pretty much off our books that held city funds, held public monies by City Source Associates. This was in relation to the Great Race. There was an OMI investigation into some activities there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But let me just start with the real, I guess, the initial shock of this. Okay, this was an off-book account. We've been through this before. We had, what's shocking about this is we've been calling for the last 10 years for there to be no accounts, no bank accounts outside of city control, outside of the purview of this office, outside of the purview of council and the mayor and the elected leadership of this city. We had a situation in the police department a couple years ago where an account was off book. People went to jail. Okay, this is a serious thing. This was a problem. You know, if that wasn't enough of a warning, we then did another call. No more accounts off book. None. No accounts. The mayor followed that up. The Mayor Peduto followed it up with an executive order formalizing this position, that there would be no accounts. So how the Parks Department continued to operate with this idea that they could still have an off-book bank account is just shocking to me. It's beyond belief that they would continue to operate this way. So let's say it again. No accounts off-book. And let's understand why that's important. When we're talking about public dollars and public spending, there's a process involved in that. And that process involves things like budget approval, a public process, a contract approval, a city council's approval. When invoices come in, that invoice goes through a process in the department to make sure that the department is okay with that expenditure. That invoice then comes here to the controller's office for a pre-audit of that invoice to make sure that we received the goods, that they were of the quality that we wanted, that all of the other approvals were in line, and before a check gets cut. None of those things happened here. None of them. What was happening here was that City Source was retained to maintain this bank account as people paid for the Great Race or sponsorship dollars came into the Great Race. They went into this bank account. They paid the expenses of the Great Race, whatever those expenses may be, but that process was done completely between them by a written memo from someone in the Parks Department. So there was none of this typical process that would go behind a payment. And of course, what happened is that you saw some funds that we can't really account for, or at least some funds that was not even Great Race related. And so we've obviously the city has taken the proper steps, closed this account. They are actually now in the process of moving the Great Race out of the city. It will be run by the Pittsburgh Marathon moving forward, and so hopefully that will, that will be a better system than what we've seen in the past. But with respect to the specific findings here, aside from just the shocking nature of the whole thing to me, you had some questions, some spending at City Source that we really do question. One is an expenditure about $100,000 that was clearly not for the Great Race. Now, their explanation for that is that that bank account was not just for the Great Race, that there were some monies that were used for senior programming and other parks functions. Again, this is stuff that shouldn't have happened. We should have known where that money was, how it was being spent, and why. There was some other spending that, as I mentioned, was the subject of an OMI investigation. Employees have been reprimanded or otherwise disciplined for that. I'm not going to go into that because that was a subject of that OMI investigation. But that certainly is what I guess originally raised some of the questions and why we were asked to take a look at the account itself. And then there's this issue with gift cards. When you go out and buy gift cards, and we don't have an understanding of how those gift cards are then distributed, well, that's a problem. And so buying gift cards at Giant Eagle and then distributing them without real understanding of how they're being distributed is a huge problem. This comes back when, at the end of the day, I guess, or when you look at the basic findings of the audit itself, you see many of the problems that we talk about a lot, and even the audits of the departments that we do here in the city. Not having proper controls, not having segregation of duties between who's writing checks, who's doing deposits. Those are the kind of things that we questioned at CitySource. Again, this is something that happened in the past. It's something that the city has stepped in and corrected. They've closed the account. It's not going to happen again, at least in this instance. But it does just raise real questions as to how people in the Parks Department could continue to have this fund that they could just access and have invoices paid out of without going through the proper channels and proper processes, especially given the history we've had over the last 5 years with these kind of accounts. The fact that, for the Parks Department now to stand up and say, well, we didn't know this one meant that. Come on, we've been around and around this issue. The fact that this account still existed is probably the most troublesome issue of the entire audit. So I will. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll take questions.
Are there any other city accounts that are still with this organization, CitySource?
So CitySource continues to maintain accounts of non-city dollars. Okay, so they do still, and we're recommending at that end as well. They actually are maintaining accounts for senior centers, and that would be the seniors' money. It's not the city's money. It's money that is raised within the senior centers themselves by the members of the senior center for trips that they do. They have raffles and they go on bus trips and that kind of thing. So some of those accounts are maintained by CitySource on behalf of the senior membership organizations, not the city itself. So they're not city dollars, and they provide that service to them at a fee, and so it's not city dollars there. So
I'd like to see that money come into the city.
I actually think that money should be accounted for separately. It's not city money, although arguably we do have some fiduciary role there because it's occurring at a city center. And so we've told them that that we've had problems with that money as well in the past. If you remember, a few years ago, we had a city center employee arrested for dipping into those kind of funds, and that's one of the reasons I think that City Parks took that money out of the city centers, and CitySource was a likely organization to manage those funds. Our biggest problem with CitySource right now is we don't care for the way they're keeping their records. They had one bank account that had both the Great Race money and the senior monies in the bank account. Now, they did keep separate ledgers within that account, but this is the kind of thing that probably would have called for having a separate account. Now, their argument was, well, you never asked us to have a separate account, and that's probably true. But it just seems the function of these two kinds of funds were so different that why would you keep them in one account rather than have separate accounts for the city money, which is, the Great Race money was owned by the city. The senior center money is not. They should have been dealt with separately.
Mike, from the Parks Department's perspective, I know there was nothing criminal that was done here, but do you think this is incompetence or just ignorance? What do you think led to this?
That's a really good question. As I said, time and time and time again, this message has been delivered. No off-book accounts. And here they were running an off-book account. I know they got new leadership in there in the last few years when the new administration came in. But when the new administration came in, one of the first things the mayor did was this executive order saying you can't have these kind of off-book accounts. And for that order to just be ignored by his own administration is shocking to me, particularly given the history. We had people go to jail for this very thing in this city shortly before the mayor took office. And to have his own administration then basically ignoring that history and his own order is really a surprise.
Do you think this is something that the administration should have taken a closer look at?
Well, I mean, I got to say, the mayor did address it. The mayor stepped up and said, hey, we can't have this. And when you have, the problem with these accounts is we don't know they exist. And this was particularly confusing because we do have a trust fund in the city that is a city-controlled account that we refer to as the Great Race Trust Fund. And it is it's where it was originally set up when the Great Race was first set up, and money does go in there, and it's not a restricted account. Money it's used for, it's really, while we call it the Great Race Trust Fund, it's really a special events trust fund because it's used to fund several different special events. So I think one of the parts that was confusing about this is when people were talking about different accounts, they had this issue confused. That, okay, yeah, well, there's a Great Race Trust Fund, that's where the Great Race money goes, but there was also this other account that was off book that was a Great Race Trust Fund as well. I think that the city, the administration has taken the appropriate steps in correcting this once they did find out about it. But the fact that Parks Department had been operating with this for so long is just it's shocking. That's all I can say.
Is there any way to know if there? You said you didn't know they exist. Is there any way to know if there are any other city accounts that are?
So what we did, I mean, when I first took office, one of the first things we did is we sent letters to every bank that we do business with, and every other bank that we knew of in the city, asking them with our tax ID number, saying, do you have any accounts under this number? And we were able to identify all those accounts. And there were some that were old accounts. Some of them were empty, closed accounts, but they still had record of. But what doesn't show up would be accounts that are not under our tax ID, and this was one of those, just like the police department was. The police department was not a city account. So there's only so much you can do, and you're going to rely on the employees to recognize when these accounts exist. Again, it was an employee who came forward based on our request for an audit. It was the employee who came forward in the police account scandal. It was, and it's surprising that employees in the Parks Department, having this history and this executive order, the fact that they didn't come forward is just a surprise. It really is. So.
What sort of punishment, for lack of a better word, do you expect coming from this?
Well, I can tell you that as a result of this original investigation, OMI did do an investigation, and there was disciplinary action taken. I don't think it's really my place to talk about that, so you might want to talk to them or to the mayor's office about that, or to the law department. But it was the law department who approached us about just taking a look at this account and identifying what the problems were. Again, the big problem I see, and I guess people have different perspectives on this, of the actual findings of this funding. The biggest problem I have is are these gift cards? How were they distributed? Who got them? Where are they? And those are the questions that we now need to go to the Parks Department and say, okay, we know this is what happened. What happened to these cards? Were they prizes to the winners of the race? Were they given to volunteers? We don't know. We don't know the answer to that question, and that's part of the problem. When you don't have these kind of checks in the system, you don't know what these expenditures are for. So when the Parks Department says to City Source, "Hey, cut us a check for $5,000 so we can go buy gift cards," who knows where that money went? So we need, it has to be, if that would have been inside the city organization, there would have been a detailed backup of what that was for, why are we buying gift cards, who are the proceeds going to, all that would have been detailed. That wasn't detailed here.
How much money are we talking about for those gift cards?
$15,000.
Is that over the period of January?
Yeah, that's
12 to April?
right.
That said, how confident are you you'll get those answers?
Well, that's a good, like I said, I think some of those answers are probably part of the OMI investigation, and so we'll need to talk to them to find out what they did. We do know that employees have been disciplined over this, but again, that's sort of out of our purview, and that's probably more a question for the law department and OMI than for us.
Without the tax number on the account, is there any way to find these off-book accounts?
That's a good question. I mean, we really do. I mean, the way that you really have to rely on the employees and the staff of the city who are participating in spending. So, but the truth is, anyone can. It's not that hard to open a bank account. I mean, you can open a bank account. the question, I guess, is how are funds, city funds, being directed to that bank account? Now, in this case, we know why. We did have a contract with this organization. That was a contract to do this work. But it really, when there should have been a process set up that if we're going to use someone else to do this kind of work, what should have been done is when there was an expenditure, that money should have been transferred to the city's general fund, and then the invoicing process could have taken its normal course. That's the way it could have happened. My guess is now that the Marathon is taking it over, that the Marathon will just take over the entire operation. So all of the invoicing will be done through them. And when there are proceeds at the end of the day, then those will be transferred to the city's general fund, and then that money will be handled in this normal course of business.
So there's no paper trail where you can look at all the money, all the public money going into a list of bank accounts?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. So, obviously, any of the trust funds that exist with the city, we know the money that goes in and out of those. But the city, our typical process when we cut checks, we have an invoice. We cut that check, and that check goes to a vendor or goes to an individual or wherever it goes. I mean, we don't. Our relationship kind of ends at that point. But with money that comes in, if we are, for instance, we're selling permits, or we are, or we're taking in fees for services. We have that. We know where that money goes, where it tracks. In this instance, and in other instances where you've had these off-book accounts, there's really no way for the city to know about them until someone says, "Hey, wait a minute, are we doing this?" And clearly, if nothing else, the mayor's executive order, people should have gotten and said, "Hey, wait a minute, what about this account?" Or, "Hey, what about that account?" And making sure, and that just didn't happen here, which is, again, given the history, quite a shock. So,
were they aware that they were violating the the mayor's executive order?
That's a good question. I can't understand how they didn't know about the executive order, and I don't understand why they ignored it. But they clearly ignored the order. Whether they saw that as a violation, I don't see how you see it any other way. So it does raise a lot of questions as to what their processes were, in the spending of that money. So
where do you go from here? It's now coming to them and saying, look,
well, the good news is this. The good news is that the city has taken the proper steps in closing the account. The money has all been transferred back into the city's general fund, so any other spending now will go through our natural process. The other thing the city has done is they have changed the way they're going to operate the Great Race. It's not going to be an in-house operation anymore. It's going to be run completely by the Pittsburgh Marathon. This will be the first year for that. Well, next year will be the first year for that, and we will watch that process. Our question there will be, at the end of the day, once the Marathon has followed on its contractual relationship to run this, and there are proceeds, we want to make sure those proceeds come into the city and are properly audited at that time. And I have pretty good confidence that that'll happen. The Marathon's done a pretty good job of that with the Pittsburgh Marathon, but in this case, we are the beneficiaries of that, as well as the amyloidosis research. So we will make sure that the funds are properly accounted for as we move forward. Okay? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you have a sense of when this account was set up? When it initially?
It was actually originally set up back, it's in the history's in there, but it was back in the 90s when it was originally set up. And again, it was, I think it was primarily set up to handle the incoming registrations and sponsorships, and then to pay the expenses of the race itself, which, whether that at that point it was because it was too much for the department, I'm not sure what the original rationale behind that was, but that's why it was set up.
And real quick on the gift cards again, you mentioned there's no documentation concerning how they were used. In the course of the audit, did anyone make any representations to your office about just verbally, unofficially how they were used?
What the city source folks told us, what they were used for prizes for the winners of the race. We've heard anecdotally that some of them were used to give to volunteers who worked that day. So that's really a question that we have now for the Parks Department is what happened to those gift cards? Because it does, the gift card issue is a difficult issue because arguably that's income. you know, and so how do you track for that? And you know, and so it just creates a real problem on a whole bunch of levels when you're dealing with those kind of benefits. So we have some real questions as to how we are going to verify who got them. To the degree that they were given to employees, that's a problem. And we don't know that happened, but we're hearing that it might have, because a number of the employees did volunteer that day for the Great Race, or over the years for the Great Race. So.
Do you have an opinion on the leadership of the Parks Department?
Well, you know, that's something that the administration is going to have to deal with. Again, a lot of, as you know, the deputy director was terminated in part over this investigation, and I know that that the mayor and his leadership have been talking to the director about this failure, but what other action they've taken, I couldn't really comment on.
And you're referring to the LMI investigation?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.